So my name is Chris Robertson, and I'm going to talk about what is a cultural intervention. And this is it's a deep question that I've been thinking about for a while. And I'm a psychotherapist, and I could say I'm not satisfied with just working in the consulting room. And together with colleagues in the Climate Psychology Alliance, I'm trying to think of a deeper way of how we can address this extraordinary denial of climate change and the crisis on our planet that we're facing, or that so many people are not facing into, because it's too terrifying. And this is, we could say, the most strong symptom, the most strong psychological symptom anywhere in the world. And we really are not addressing it very well. James Hillman suggested that we need to look through the mirror of our consulting room and allow the world in. And that seems to be a metaphor for permeability. If we see that our consulting rooms maybe do offer a containment to allow that individual permeability to be held, because it is scary to open to the depths of these horrors. It really is. So that needs to be held, but at the same time, not held so tight that we shut the world out. Allowing the world to enter into the consulting room means that actually we are making interventions at the level of the culture. So my focus in this presentation is not on individual maladies or neurosis, but rather on the urgent need to develop a collective perspective on our cultural wounds and complexes, which if we don't, our children will inherit an endangered and impoverished world. And what I'm trying to think about this morning is culture, but not high culture like in art or opera, but rather how we cook, how we dress, how we tell each other stories, because these are the ways that we're embedded, these are the ways we relate to each other, and in which we experience and perceive the world. So much of our language through which our cultural life is propagated has become self-referential and seldom points beyond itself. Self-referring at a cultural level means a divorce from the environment, as if we're not dependent and as if there were no real consequences to our exploitative action. So what I'm trying to present is the idea that our suffering, what we suffer from, our alienation, our depression, our mania, our violence, our narcissism, our self-harm, our uncare, and our dissociation, to name a few symptoms, are all as a result of our culture. Many of my colleagues would say that when they're working with individuals in their consulting room, they are working with the culture, because these individuals are bringing, their individual clients are bringing the problems of the culture with them. I think that's true, but so often it's almost as if actually they're adapting, we could say. There's plenty of psychotherapy that is helping the individuals adapt to the culture. And this has been challenged by radical psychotherapy going back to Ronnie Lang in the 60s, pointing out the illnesses as much with the family as it is with the individual. And I would say it's more with the culture. That's where we have to really get a sense of perspective and see through the symptoms the individual is bringing, see that they're all at the effect of our culture. And one of the original cultural interventions that I'm aware of, it's also, we could say, a climate change intervention, is this extraordinary story that Jung liked to tell about the rainmaker. And this is a story about a Chinese village, and this is a village in a drought. And they tried all their usual things, and they'd all failed. The invocations, the little bits of charms, and nothing was working. And they did hear that there's a shaman, a rainmaker, in a nearby province, and that he was apparently able to produce rain. So they sent for him, and he came after a while, and he looked around, he heard their problems. And he said, is there a hut somewhere out the village, closer to the mountains? And they said, yes, there is such a hut. So they took him to this hut, which was considerably outside the village, but you could still see it. And he said, just leave me here with some water, and we'll see what happens. And they left him, and nothing happened the first day. No rain. Second day, still nothing happening, and the beginning of restlessness. The officials were beginning to worry, and almost on the third day, they're beginning to give up hope that anything will happen, and suddenly the clouds appear, and the rain starts, and it pours and it pours, and even though they're wet, they're jubilant and delighted, and now all their frustration is forgotten, and they rush to congratulate the rainmaker and thank him profusely. But he says, I didn't do anything. No, you're not understanding. I did nothing. The rain came by itself. So they said, but you've been here for 3 days. That's what we've been waiting for. And the rain has come. And we're so grateful to you. And he's saying, no, you don't understand. It's not the I that have made the rain. It's true that when I arrived here, I felt your disharmony. And I became out of sorts myself. It affected me. And I knew I had to put myself in a better place. That's why I had to come to the hut and sort myself out first. And then as soon as I sorted myself out, the rain came by itself, because everything does flow according to its own rhythm when we allow it to. Thinking about this, what could this be a model for in terms of our own practice as activists, as psychotherapists? And it seems quite challenging, because initially it seems like he's doing nothing. And so often, because of the stress in the world and the anxiety about the climate crisis, the notion of doing nothing is extremely challenging, especially because we live in a manic culture and there's a desire to do something because we're all infected by this. So that's the first clue, maybe, is that we have to work with this infection. We have to work with this sense of being affected by the culture. And as psychotherapists, we understand a little bit about being infected by our clients, especially if we're working in a relational way. We are affected by them, and we have to work with that sort of poison, that toxicity they're bringing in with us. But what would that mean to work with the poison in the culture? I mean, it sounds quite scary, and maybe that's why we need some container in the process. And it's quite interesting to see that the rainmaker asks for this hut. He doesn't say he wants to sit out in the open and be in the countryside. He takes this classic shamanic position of being in between, in that intermediate zone between the village and its environment. Because there he can be the mediator, he can feel the distress of the village, but he can also attune to what's happening in the wider environment. And I think that's a really important notion of, can the consulting room be this intermediate zone? Can it be this transitional space where the client enters into it and immediately they're in a different space and they can feel that other reality? They're not so wrapped up, they're not so caught in the cultural constructs that they brought with them. But the therapist can feel infected by that. And they have to work with that, with the client, to see if there's some remedy, some remedial action. And then that's quite tricky, isn't it? Because the rainmaker is following a Taoistic principle of non-action or watchful awareness, as Lao Tzu would have said in the Tao Te Ching, that the watchful awareness is what leads to non-interfering action. There is a climate crisis, and it does need to be addressed. but where we address it from our own anxiety, our own desire to produce a change, is maybe part of the problem. So I have to ask myself, is this an avoidance? Is this a way of just escaping from the horrors that we're facing, from the loss of species, from the loss of languages, from so much that we are losing that is absolutely tragic? And I would think that creating a space for grieving those things is definitely a cultural intervention. But where does that come from in me? If I'm wanting to make it better, if I'm effectively trying to create some sort of panacea, that's not going to work, because I have to really get to the nub of this, the nub of really where the action needs to come from. And it's a huge challenge, as the Rainmaker says, it's not coming from me. It's not myself or my ego. I'm getting out of the way. And this is both in Jungian thinking, this is a sort of participation mystique. This is Jung drawing on Levi Bruhl to understand that some things seem to happen in a mysterious way of their own accord. But also it's drawing on this acausal notion of things not being connected by one thing causing another, but by some sort of synchronous relation. And when I've been thinking about this story, I'm struck by the fact that the Rainmaker doesn't seem interested in making any social comment about what's led this village to be out of harmony. He's just putting his house in order. He doesn't say, what are you doing wrong? He's in no way interested in blaming them or attributing them as the cause, even though he does point out that they are in disharmony and he's affected by that. And I think that's really important and fascinating, how to feel the effects of the disharmony but not attribute blame. And there's also thinking more psychotherapeutically. As the Rainmaker comes, it's as if he's being perceived as a heroic rescuer. He's come to bring the rain. And there's all the projections, we could say, the transference that the villagers are putting on him. And he seems to be not affected by that. He's certainly not falling into being the magician who can bring the rain. He's absolutely refusing to be seen in that way. And I think that's very interesting. He's allowing their frustration with his not doing anything to work its own way through. And I'm imagining that at just this point where they're feeling that hope is, he's not going to do anything, that's just the moment they let go, they are giving up hope, that's just when the rain comes. This is such a deep and complex issue, and I'm just making a start on it, and I'm thinking the old political notions of are you part of the problem or are you a solution to it is already a binary opposition. That part of this Taoistic way of thinking is that we're both the solution and the problem at the same time. And putting my own house in order, if I'm thinking just as a separate individual, that's fine for me, but not for anyone else. But if I'm really know and deeply understand that I'm interconnected with everything, then of course putting my own house in order is affecting everything. So it's probably true that every individual session, every individual psychotherapeutic session is affecting the whole culture. But it would certainly be a more powerful intervention if as psychotherapists we had that context that we are working at the cultural level, and that what our clients are coming with is not just to do with their individual history, but they're bringing the problems from their individual life, they're bringing problems from their family, and they're bringing the problems from their culture. It's like a sort of nest of Russian dolls, isn't it? One is compacted within the other. And if we bring that awareness to it, and we can hear that they're often burdened because they're probably apprehending that this is just to do with them, when it isn't. It's they're suffering the toxicity of the culture. And that's when we start to name that, and we start to help them see these different levels, that in itself is a very powerful intervention.